All right, everyone. For the people in the back, everyone hear me okay? Thumbs up, we're good? All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this talk, especially after lunch. I know some of us are probably, we have full bellies and maybe in a comatose state at this point. I hope to not put you to sleep with this presentation. So my name is Scott ADDIE. I am a member of the Docs team at Microsoft, and specifically I'm aligned with the ASP.NET Core product team. My role there is understanding myself what are these new features in ASP.NET Core that the team has built, and then how do I digest that and break it down into something that our customers can easily use and understand. And what we're here today to talk about is primarily tag helpers and view components in ASP.NET Core. And I'd like to start first of all with a show of hands in the audience. Who is using ASP.NET Core today? Okay, so we have 40% of the room. For those that didn't raise your hands, I'm assuming you're doing ASP.NET proper or 4.x. Is that true with a show of hands? Okay, that's what I suspected. So the current release of ASP.NET Core is 2.0. We will cover everything from the beginning release, 1.0, all the way up to 2.0 in this presentation. What I'd like to start with is an agenda of things we will be covering in this talk. First, I'd like to start with just a review of options. As we saw, 60% of the room roughly is not using ASP.NET Core yet. So for those folks, I like to start off with, here's what you're using today to build reusable UI components. And from there, we'll dive into, here's what you're missing out on in ASP.NET Core. Here are things that could make your life easier. From there, we'll look at tag helpers, and this is a new feature that is there as of ASP.NET Core 1.0. And then we'll go into view components. The same is true for view components. This is a brand new feature in ASP.NET Core, there as of 1.0. Serves a slightly different purpose than tag helpers. It's a little more advanced. Then we'll look at mixing those two concepts together. Once we've grasped what is a tag helper, what is a view component, how do we use a view component as a tag helper? And we'll wrap things up in this talk with recommended use cases. So we have all of these wonderful shiny features in ASP.NET Core. When is it most appropriate to use one option over the other? So we'll dive right into the recap. HTML helpers are something that we've had in ASP.NET proper MVC since the very beginning. And the syntax would look something like this. You're going to use Razor syntax in your Razor view. So at HTML dot, some function that you will be invoking to display a piece of UI in that application. And in this case, that function we're invoking is label. The label text associated with the DOM element that would be rendered is first name separated by a space, ending in a colon. And we're relying on this anonymous C# object in this particular example here to set a CSS class that will be used when rendering this label in the HTML web page. Before I go further with this, you're going to notice in the corner of the slides throughout this presentation, I have this blue icon up in the top, just to remind you in which worlds are these features supported that I'm talking about. And as we said, in the case of HTML helpers, that's going to be there both in ASP.NET proper or 4.x, same thing. It's also there in ASP.NET Core. But let's take a look at HTML helpers. Where do these shine? Where do they, cause problems? Well, we already talked about you're invoking these as methods inside of a Razor view, which unlocks sort of a fluent API where you can find yourself chaining method calls together to do pretty complex things with these UI elements. The problem, one of the problems with HTML helpers has historically been poor IntelliSense support in the tooling. And take Visual Studio as an example here. As soon as we rely on this anonymous C# object that's depicted in this example here, IntelliSense throws its hands up and says, you're on your own. I really don't know what you're attempting to do at this point. You're living in the danger zone. Another problem, some see this as a problem, some don't, is the context switching that is occurring. So you find yourself weaving in and out of HTML markup and C# code, or it could be VB and ASP.NET 4.x. Some developers would tell you that context switching is a friction point that only slows them down, does not make them more productive. And so that's one of the biggest complaints that I've heard about using HTML helpers. Another common complaint is HTML helpers were not necessarily designed with testing in mind. Test-driven development wasn't necessarily all the rage when HTML helpers were initially designed. You're going to see as a common theme, once you move to ASP.NET Core, the product team is really encouraging you to write testable code. And we see that through the native dependency injection that is there in ASP.NET Core. That's one feature that is sort of encouraging you, giving you a nudge. Hey, you probably should be writing testable code here. We're going to assist you along the way, giving you proper tools and methodologies to do that. So from there, we go into partial views. Again, supported in ASP.NET 4.x as well as ASP.NET Core. What does this look like? Well, we would invoke a partial view using syntax similar to this. Looked very similar to what we were doing with HTML helpers on the previous slide. This would be, pointing to some, in this case, underscore author partial CSHTML file. And that CSHTML file might consist of nothing more than, say, some markup for a repeated static component all throughout your application. Maybe you decide to stuff your footer markup or your header markup into this partial view. Whatever markup it is that you want to reuse throughout your application, partial views were really intended for that. As a naming convention, you might have noticed underscore is used in the name here, author partial, just a convention that a lot of people will follow to just denote this is indeed a partial view. As we mentioned, these allow for sharing of common view elements in your Razor view all throughout your application. And what we saw in ASP.NET 4.x is partial views were commonly coupled with child actions. You may have seen in your MVC controllers, some of those actions in the controller were decorated with a child action attribute. And the problem with child action, and we'll talk more about this later, is child action is not a concept in ASP.NET Core. That's something that has disappeared once you move to ASP.NET Core. Partial views, additionally, are not necessarily recommended when code execution is needed, anything of any complexity. You can certainly do it, but then again, testability suffers. You're mixing different concerns in the application. And what I've personally found with partial views is you can quickly get yourself into trouble here. You'll find less experienced developers, or maybe very experienced developers on a tight timeline, stuffing core business logic into the view layer. And that's a problem, and it will be eventually. Again, we're seeing this common theme of partial views weren't necessarily designed with testing in mind. You can certainly do it, but it's a bit of an effort. So with that in mind, we've looked at HTML helpers, partial views. How does ASP.NET Core expand this suite of tools that are available to us as UI developers? How does it ease the pain? Well, tag helpers is the first thing we wanted to talk about here. And as I said early on, ASP.NET Core only. From 1.0, the very beginning, up until 2.0, nothing drastic changes there. What are tag helpers? I like to think of them as a way of expressing server-side rendering logic in the form of something that looks like HTML markup. Has anyone in the room done a fair amount of AngularJS Angular work with a show of hands? Okay, that's a fair amount. So I picked a decent example there. The way I like to explain tag helpers to those that have done AngularJS Angular, or even React development with JSX components. It's essentially the server-side rendition of what you would have in those SPA frameworks. Instead of an Angular JS directive executing on the client, Tag Helper looks very much the same, except it's executing on the server, which shouldn't be a surprise to anyone because we all know ASP.NET is a server-side rendering framework for building applications. Tag helpers allow you to attach to existing elements in your Razor views, and as we'll see later on, you can also write your own custom tag helpers. IntelliSense support here is far superior to anything that we covered in that recap section of this talk. The reason for this is when you create your own tag helper, that is actually backed by a C# class that you have created. Any property you include in that tag helper class that you have marked as public is made available to IntelliSense. So you create this tag helper, hand that off to your team of developers to consume that tag helper or that set of tag helpers, and it's pretty easy for them to reason about, what does this thing do? How does it work? It works a lot like the prop type system in React if you've used that. It gives you a way of predicting how this thing works without even looking at the underlying code or the documentation for that particular tag helper. The tag helpers also eliminate those rough edges we had with HTML helpers, where we found ourselves weaving in and out of HTML and C# code. And that was something that really muddied up our views. It made them more difficult to reason about. And thankfully, they were designed with testing in mind. Again, ASP.NET Core ships with this native IOC container, and that is, one of the biggest contributing factors to the high testability that we have with tag helpers. What does a tag helper look like? Well, very basic example here, sticking with the theme of the label that we looked at with HTML helpers. You can see here we have just a very plain label HTML tag. Nothing special, we've probably all seen this. And you'll notice instead of relying on that anonymous C# object to set the CSS class to caption, I'm able to do that just using regular HTML. ASP-4, what is this? Well, let's look at the components that we're actually seeing here on this slide. Our target element is that HTML tag. Nothing earth-shattering there. Tag helper attribute. This is where tag helpers are being used. So ASP.NET Core ships with roughly 18 or 19 tag helpers out of the box. This is one of those. And in fact, for those that are curious, all of ASP.NET Core is open source. And if you wanted to see the source code for the tag helpers that Microsoft ships, you could actually do that by going out to github.com/ASP.NET/MVC. The source code for those 18 or 19 tag helpers is all available there, and that's a great resource to go take a look at once you start building your own tag helpers. And the final thing we're seeing here is, just that standard HTML attribute. So as let's go back to what we said before. We are expressing server-side rendering logic in the form of markup. That's all that's going on here. Nothing intimidating. It's actually very easy to use these things. IntelliSense is great. So you can build your own tag helpers. Before you do that, I recommend that you take a look out in the marketplace. Telerik, I'd encourage you that you visit their booth out here, and they can tell you more about what I'm about to talk about here. They have a product offering called UI for ASP.NET Core. Let's assume we're building a web application, and I can tell you, for me personally, almost every line of business application I have written in the last 10 years has required some use of a date picker in a form that I'm building. Using this UI for ASP.NET Core offering, we're able to invoke or consume a tag helper that they have created for us. And the way that we do that is use the syntax that you see up here, kendo-datepicker. What you see after kendo-datepicker is essentially where we are setting those public properties that are defined on the C# class. we're saying the name of the markup that's generated, the actual date picker element, will be set to start date. The start year will be, or the view will be the calendar view, the year of that. We want to have the initial depth of the calendar set to the year panel. We're setting the date format, as you can see there. And we're just passing it a starting date to pre-select when it initially pops up and renders. What's the value in this? It's tough to grok what that value really is by looking at just this markup here. Well, when this renders, it takes care of all kinds of concerns that sort of fall to the wayside in the enterprise. The primary one being accessibility. Again, speaking from experience, it's oftentimes the case that a project kicks off. You have a very tight timeline that needs to be met. Don't have much of a budget to complete that project. And so accessibility is often one of the very first features that is on the chopping block. You might hear your project manager say, we recognize accessibility is important, but how many of our users does that really equate to? Is that 5% of our users? More often than not, the number is actually much higher than that. And these project managers, or whoever these people are underestimating the impact by putting that feature on the chopping block. And so what you see in this particular example up here is this widget is injecting all of the JavaScript, the jQuery code that is needed to make this widget fully functional. It is also, going back to the accessibility concern we were talking about, it is adding area and role attributes. So that if we have any users that are relying on assistive devices like screen readers, that screen reader is able to detect things like in what state is this widget right now? Is that date picker open? Has a date actually been selected? Or is it still wanting me to select a date from this widget? These are all important things, important concerns that when you use third-party tag helpers like this, they've already thought ahead about these types of things and taken care of that work for you. It's a big time saver. Outside of the Telerik offerings you have here, the open source community is very active. There are actually a couple of Microsoft MVPs that have built an entire library of tag helpers around using Bootstrap, the responsive design web framework. So if you wanted to, for example, render things like a modal in your application, these people I mentioned have already built a tag helper you can use to render a mobile or a modal in your application. And the syntax is going to look very similar to what we've seen thus far. Very simple to use. But okay, so we've seen HTML helpers versus tag helpers. And a lot of people aren't really sold on it quite yet. They might have seen some cool things that they saw. Let's look at the difference. So over on this side of the slide, what I've done is I've built a form in my Razor view using HTML helpers. What I like to draw my eye to in that example is every instance where I'm relying on Razor syntax, all of these yellow highlights you're seeing in that screenshot, I see these as friction points, and that's just a personal preference. Others absolutely love that, and there's nothing wrong with that. For the people that think like me and see those as friction points where there's context switching going on, you would want to draw your attention to the other side of this slide where I've built that same exact form except using tag helpers. And I'm not using any custom tag helpers here. These are all tag helpers that ship with ASP.NET Core. And I was able to recreate that same form using tag helpers instead of HTML helpers. So you'll see, at the top of this example, I have a form tag, and I'm using an attribute called ASP-controller. And what that's saying is, when this form submits, I expect you to use the account controller, my MVC controller. ASP.action follows that attribute, and it assigns the name of the action inside of account controller that should be invoked. In my opinion, that's easier on the eyes. Again, personal preference. The key takeaway here is, on this slide, I'm not trying to say tag helpers are consuming HTML helpers and that HTML helpers are going away. That's not the case at all. In fact, I can take the best of both worlds here. I can mix HTML helpers and tag helpers in the same form, and that's perfectly fine. You won't get yourself into trouble doing that. But let's look at, okay, if I wanted to build my own tag helper, what would really be involved in doing that? And so what I've done is I've built, in this case, an ASP.NET Core 2.0 application targeting .NET Core 2.0, and I've built a custom tag helper. And don't feel like you have to furiously write notes as I'm going through the code here. I'll share the GitHub repos out at the end of this presentation, so you'll have access to the samples I'm showing as well as the slides. Let me run this first so you can see, okay, what does all of this code even do? And so what this particular tag helper does is it renders 2 hands of playing cards. It's just some make-believe card game that I've come up with. And each of those 2 players has 3 cards in their hand. John Doe and Jane Doe. You can see each player has 3 cards. Their picture is on there. Each card has a rank and a suit. So we can see, John has an ace of hearts. Jane, her cards are below that. Now let's look at the markup that was generated here. If I do an inspect element, you'll see there's, nothing, there are really no clues in the rendered markup here that we've done this with a tag helper. It's just plain old HTML. And so with that in mind, let me dive into the code and show you how we built this. And this is actually 2 tag helpers that are being used to render what you see on this page. There's a hand tag helper and a card tag helper that's nested within the hand tag helper. A little more of an advanced example, but the goal here is to show you the type of complexity that is possible with tag helpers. So the convention when building your own tag helpers is to create a tag helpers folder in the root of your project, which is what I've done here. Let's take a look at the hand tag helper because that's going to be the parent tag helper in this particular scenario. And you can see it's nothing more than lines 10 through the end of this file that were used to accomplish that, to build that hand tag helper. Now let's just look through the code real quick and explain, what's going on. On line 10, I have decorated this tag helper class with an attribute called HTML target element. And I am passing that a constant that is set to a string of hand, lowercase. What is that? What that's doing is that is telling the tag helper that in order to use this tag helper, to invoke it, I must use a hand tag in my Razor view. So less than hand is how I would invoke this. And you can set up the tag structure, setting that property on this attribute. And what that allows you to do is define, how this, how the markup looks in the Razor view. Is it a self-closing tag? Is it by self-closing I mean slash greater than? Or is that not necessary? What does that look like? Attributes, any custom attributes that you want to set, you can accomplish that here by setting the attributes property. Something a little more interesting though, line 13, what is this attribute responsible for? Well, remember we said there's some nesting going on here. So if we take a look at the actual tag helper and how that's being invoked, this will hopefully make a little more sense. So I have an index Razor view. Lines 9 through 19, that's where I am creating these 2 hands of cards. You can see line 9, less than hand, space player equals John. I'm setting his name. Nested within there are the 3 cards that John has, and I'm setting a suit and a rank on each of those. With that in mind, let's go back to the hand tag helper and sort of look at this side by side to make sense of what we're looking at. what restrict children, what this attribute is saying is if any markup at all appears inside of a hand tag helper, it should only be a card tag. And that's that card tag helper. That's what's going on here. I'm saying restrict children should only be, you can see when I hover over IntelliSense, it's saying card. The only element that can possibly appear in here is card, and that is true in our example here. We've got 3 occurrences of that. Let's take a look at what else is going on. You'll notice on line 16, we have a public property of type string called player, and that is why on line 9, on the other panel, I'm able to set that property equal to a string value, in this case the name of the player. Any custom tag helper that you create will have to include this process method that you're seeing here on line 18. And this is what's doing all of the heavy lifting. The key points to take away with the process method are line 26, where I'm saying output.tagname equals div. That is saying when this hand tag helper is rendered in the browser, that parent element, that top level element, should be a div tag. On line 27, what's going on is I'm saying I'm going to append to that parent div tag a CSS class, a class attribute, and I'm going to set that equal to row, which in this case is actually a bootstrap class. It's going to make this responsive. With that in mind then, one other detail that we glossed over was you notice on line 14 when we've defined this public class, we have derived from the tag helper class that ships with ASP.NET Core. Building your own custom tag helpers is as simple as that. It's just a C# class, which we can all handle. Deriving from Tag Helper, set some public properties, and include a process method where you're doing the heavy lifting. But what does the card tag helper look like? That one was a little more complex to build, so let's take a look. So if we look at card tag helper, it's very much the same thing that's going on. One key difference is going to be on line 12, this HTML target element attribute that we're setting. This is our chance to tell it, there are really 2 properties on here that should be set. And those are the suit and the rank. And the syntax here is unfortunately a bit clunky, but when you have more than one property that you expect to be set, the way you would do that is create a comma delimited list of property names. And to avoid the use of magic strings here, what I've used is the C# name of operator. And so this would give me suit as a string, and this would give me rank as a string. And it would separate those 2 string values with a comma. Again, here we're defining, what the structure of the markup looks like that is responsible for using this card tag helper. In this case, we're saying it could be normal or self-closing, and if you hover over IntelliSense, it helps explain what that really means when you make that decision. Gives you an example. It's a public class inheriting from Tag Helper. We're doing some constructor injection here. This is some of the goodness that ASP.NET Core gives you. And here's the enums that are defined, representing the various suits that can be used in the card deck, as well as the card ranks that are possible. And then this view context property that I've defined here is unique in that this is what I needed to use to make a couple of things possible in this particular example. What I wanted to do in this example was I wanted to, instead of embedding the markup, the HTML markup in this C# class, I wanted to stuff that in an external Razor view. And so you'll notice that this process async method, you notice this is async, the previous one was process. Synchronous or asynchronous, either one is okay, depends on your use case. What I'm doing though is, again, I'm setting the root tag name to a div tag. I'm setting a CSS class on that. I am then hydrating an instance of this card view model. And instead of, I could have hard-coded the HTML that was necessary in here to represent a card. Instead, on line 79, what I'm saying is, why don't you go off and look at this partial card view and just render the contents of that when invoking this card tag helper. It's just pointing to views shared partials card, and I'm passing to that the view model to be bound to that particular partial view. The last line to make that actually work is output.content, and we're going to set the HTML content to whatever comes back when rendering that partial view that we're pointing at. And so if I look at what that partial view looks like, there's nothing different here from ASP.NET 4.x. It's just a partial view. Nothing has changed. Just to show you that's possible. And we talked about testability. A lot of people wonder, okay, well, how would you go about testing a tag helper? You said, testability is something that this was intended to support very well. Well, I've created a test project here, and this is using XUnit. And all I've done is I've written a simple unit test just to show you, how would you accomplish that? What might it look like? And so the syntax in XUnit is we would annotate our test method with fact. It's not returning anything. And there's actually 3 different assertions that we are making in this test method. And we've got our typical steps: arrange, act, assert. And to be honest, much of what you see in this test method is boilerplate that could be used across many of your test methods. You could easily abstract that out of this method and tuck it away somewhere else for reuse, maybe in a startup method somewhere. The key things to notice are line 16, we are saying we expect the root element of the rendered output to be a div tag. And it's not until line 33 when we invoke this process method that the actual that we're actually set up at that point to make assertions. And so line 37 is where we're saying, we really expect that root element that we set up above of div to match whatever comes back when this tag helper is rendered after process has completed executing. And there's actually one Visual Studio feature I often like to show off here is something called live unit testing that really shines in use cases like this. Has anyone used live unit testing in Visual Studio 2017? So we've got a few hands. I believe it's available at the top tier, Enterprise, and no other tiers at this point. But let me just show you, while we're talking about it, how it works. So I'm using the latest release of Visual Studio 2017 up here. And if I were to go to the test menu, live unit testing, start, that's going to fire up the live unit testing engine. You can actually configure that to fire up upon solution load if it's something you intend to use all the time. This is a very similar product to something like nCrunch, which is a vended product out in the marketplace. And you'll notice as soon as I enabled that, I've got a series of glyph icons that appear in the gutter over here. Check marks, dashes. The other option you'd see would be a red X, just indicating, what does my code coverage look like? Does this particular line of code get covered by unit test at all? And so check mark generally means we're good, we're covered by a test. A blue dash is typically an indication for there's room for improvement. Maybe we could write a test to cover this line if it makes sense. The reality is it oftentimes doesn't make sense to achieve 100% coverage in your code base. At some point, you're going to hit that threshold where you're writing tests just to write tests. There's really no return on investment. And so let's open our tag helper. This is testing the hand tag helper. Let me close these other files. And I'm actually going to put these side by side so you can see what's going on here. Now what I'm going to do is in my test, in this panel over here, I'm going to change this root element from div to, let's say, span. And when I do that, I expect live unit testing to tell me something has broken, you have created a problem. And the reason for that is line 26 in the tag helper is where I've said the root element that will render when this executes is a div tag. So over here, I know I'm going to cause it to fail when I say span. I am not even hitting save. and you're going to notice that the icons change. You'll notice now they've changed to red. That is my indication that I have broken something. Somewhere along the line, I took a wrong turn. Thankfully, I know how to fix this. I can just change this back to div. Again, I'm not even saving. And these should go to green, back how they started. There's also an output panel for live unit testing. You can look here for the output to see that sure enough, it actually is running the tests. So really good product to look at, not really related to the talk, so we won't go into a deep dive, but keep that in mind when testing things like tag helpers and view components. All right, let's take one quick look then at Solution Explorer. So we looked at CardTag Helper, hand tag helper. Really, that's the meat of this demo. That's what's doing all of the work. And we said we're pointing to a partial view for that hand tag helper, or the CardTag Helper rather, and that's right here. So to build a tag helper, really all you need to understand that's new in core is how to build the C# class itself. And we walked through that at length. Let's jump back into the slides. And we're going to talk about view components. View components, we said child actions are no longer a thing in ASP.NET Core. They do not exist. View components are intended to be a replacement for those. View components you can think of as lighter weight, more performant than child actions. And unfortunately, they don't participate in the controller lifecycle. So what does that actually mean to you as a developer? Well, it means you can't use things like action filters with view components. Again, going back to the fact that they don't have knowledge of that controller lifecycle. So using an action filter isn't a possibility, at least not at this point. Designed with testing in mind, we've beaten that point to death, so we'll gloss over it. What does a view component look like? There's a bit more complexity here, but don't be intimidated. They are still fairly simple to build. There are two components that make up a view component, and that first one, no surprise, is a C# class that, in this example, derives from view component. If that convention kind of gives you the chills and you'd rather not derive from view component, we've got you covered. There are two other possibilities to define a C# class as a view component. You can either decorate that C# class with the view component attribute, or you can simply suffix the C# class name with view component. So 3 different ways that you can define a class as a view component. The second piece to the view component, no surprise, is the Razor view itself. And again, this is just very simple stuff, nothing new here from ASP.NET 4X. It's the same concepts. You'll notice up at the top there, just as we've done all along, we're pointing to some model or view model that will be bound to this Razor view. Now, view search paths, there are actually 2 places that the runtime will look. The first path is views / whatever the controller name is / components / whatever the view component name is / the actual view name. The second path where it will look, and by the way, the second path is actually the preferred location, is views shared components / the name of the view component / the name of the view. And the default view name that it will look for by default is default.cshtml. Much like in your views folder, the default view name is index.cshtml. It should be no surprise because MVC is all about convention over configuration. If you follow the conventions that they've put into place, you're in for a very easy ride. Now, there are 3 different ways that you can invoke a view component, and this is where we're going to talk about how do you mix tag helpers and view components together. That'll be something that's covered on this slide. The first approach you can use is what I would refer to as traditional. And this is the one that you'll probably most frequently see used. The second one is Tag Helper, and the third one is the controller approach. Let's look at examples. So the traditional approach says, we're going to use syntax like this. And in this case, it's an asynchronous invocation of the view component. And we've said, component dot. As soon as we say component dot in our Razor view, that's the runtime's, or that's ASP.NET Core's cue that this is indeed a view component that we intend to use. And we're saying invoke async. There's also an invoke method you could have used there. Again, in the spirit of avoiding magic strings, I've made use of the C# name of operator here. And what I've done specifically is I've said name of current weather. So what this example is actually doing is it's depicting the pieces of a view component I've built to represent a current weather view component that will call into a third-party API and pull back the current weather forecast. And you can see I'm passing an anonymous C# object there, setting the city to Chicago, the state to Illinois. That's the city and state that I'd like to get a forecast for. The second option, which is personally for me much more appealing, is invoking the view component as something that looks like a tag helper. Big note here on approach number 2. If you want to invoke a view component as a tag helper, you must be on at least ASP.NET Core 1.1. That's something that was introduced in the 1.1 release. The other key takeaway there is if you want to invoke a view component as a tag helper, you would out of the box use that VC : prefix. And that again is the cue that this isn't really a tag helper, it's a view component, but I'm using it as a tag helper. It's wearing a costume. And the third approach that's possible is, returning the view component, the rendered version of the view component, as a type of action result. A view component result is actually the type of action result that would be returned here. But honestly, it's those first two approaches that you would encounter much more frequently than the last. So let's take a look at a demo. As was the case with tag helpers, I've got a sample app here. I'm going to run this to show you, what it's actually doing. And in this case, as I alluded to, I'm building a view component that calls out to a third-party API, pulls back the current weather forecast, in this case for Chicago in the US. And it's going to show me all kinds of detail here. Current weather for Chicago, US. Current conditions are it's misty. We've got a Bulgarian translation there. We've got an icon depicting that weather condition. And then below that we have the current weather, the temperature, the low temperature for the day, the high temperature, and the current humidity. All translated in this case to Celsius. Across the top here, and I'm pointing this out for if you look at the sample code later, I have a link demonstrating each of those three invocation approaches that we discussed. Tab number 1, which we're looking at here, is the traditional invocation approach. Tab number 2 is invoking as a tag helper. Tab number 3 is returning that view component result from your controller. And you're going to notice the output doesn't really change. It's the same stuff that's returned. It's just different approaches you're taking to invoke that view component that you've built. So let's take a quick look at the code and how do we accomplish this. And you're going to see, as I mentioned, view components are a bit more involved to create, but I still wouldn't call it difficult. The convention now, much like we had with tag helpers, is you're going to have a view components folder in the root of your project, which I have right here. It's in there that I've created this C# class again. I called it current weather. It derives from view component, which is a class that ships with ASP.NET Core. I'm using ASP.NET Core's native IOC container doing constructor injection here so that I can make use of iWeather service downstream in this class. And you can see here I've got 4 different input parameters being passed to this invoke method. I've got the city, the state abbreviation, the temperature scale, meaning is it Fahrenheit or is it Celsius, and the language. Is this French? Is this English? Is this Bulgarian? I have the opportunity to set those options when I invoke this view component. And down below, it's not as important, but this is where I'm making that call off to the third-party web API to retrieve that forecast. I am then mapping that response to a view model down on line 25, and I am passing that hydrated view model to the view for rendering in this application. So let's take a look at, how is this actually used? So what we're looking at here, starting on line 9, this is that traditional invocation approach. We're doing it asynchronously. We're saying at await component.invoke async, avoiding using a magic string by using the C# name of operator. And then there's this anonymous object where we're setting those 4 input parameters that were expected in the method that we just looked at in the C# class. We're setting the city to Chicago, the state abbreviation to Illinois, the temperature scale to Celsius, and the language translation for the current conditions to Bulgarian. You're going to notice the very similar thing going on with the Tag Helper approach for invoking a view component. Much cleaner, as you're noticing. Again, my preferred approach. If Razor is something you would like to avoid at all costs, use this approach here. And then finally, we have the controller invocation approach here. There's an example for that. What else should we take a look at? I've got a service here. You would have noticed in the view component I was doing that constructor injection. It's actually giving me an instance of this weather service, which is calling out to the weather service and pulling back the actual forecast. All right. One thing that I did forget to mention with tag helpers, and I'm going to point it out now because it also applies with view components when you're invoking them as tag helpers, is in your view imports CS/HTML file, you're going to need to use this add tag helper directive. And you're seeing that the specific one I'm referring to is on line 3 in this file. It's that add tag helper directive that is registering these tag helpers with the runtime, with IntelliSense. So without doing this, for example, without registering your tag helpers with your application, IntelliSense would never provide any assistance. It would simply be unaware of any tag helpers that you've created. So do not forget this line. If you're building tag helpers or view components that you intend to invoke as tag helpers, what you see on line 3 is completely necessary. Going back to the Tag Helpers sample app to show you a slightly different way to do that, say I only have a couple of tag helpers in my application, you can register them individually. So I've got 2 lines here because there were only 2 tag helpers, one for CardTag Helper, one for HandTag Helper. The alternative syntax is what we saw in the view components demo where we just use an asterisk. And that's the way of telling it, just register any custom view component that you find in this application. This is a shortcut way of doing what I showed you in the other sample application. All right, let's go back into the slides. And let's talk about recommended use cases. So when we talk about HTML helpers versus tag helpers, my personal opinion is prefer tag helpers when Razor is simply unappealing to you, but basic HTML markup is very appealing. If testability is of paramount importance to your team, maybe you should prefer tag helpers. The exception here might be if you're porting an existing application from ASP.NET 4X to ASP.NET Core, you might not have the time or the budget to rewrite those. And that's fine. As we saw, HTML helpers are still supported. Prefer HTML helpers when Razor is appealing, or like we were talking about, porting an app from ASP.NET 4.x to ASP.NET Core. Oftentimes, you'll find your boss saying, if it's not broken, just leave it alone. And that's a big reason why HTML helpers are still there. They're not going away. There's still a very large crowd that loves them. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. They will continue to be supported. It's just another tool in your tool belt. If we look at recommendations for partial views versus view components, you should prefer view components when there's any kind of complex business logic that needs to occur. A perfect use case for a view component would be things like, hey, I'm building a login panel for my application that maintains the logged in, logged out state of the user and maybe calls off to some database or Active Directory. Another example would be a shopping cart in an e-commerce site, or maybe even a tag cloud on your personal blog. All very good use cases for a view component because there's some degree of complex rendering logic that needs to occur behind the scenes. And you wouldn't necessarily want to stuff all of that logic into a partial view. Testability is very important. Well, view components are a great option there, and the way that you would test these is very similar to what we saw with tag helpers. If that tag helper support is desired, and what we're really referring to there is invocation approach number 2, invoking a view component as a tag helper. If that's something that really appealed to you, by all means, view components are the way to go. Prefer partial views when you're just simplifying larger chunks of markup that will be reused throughout the application. If you want to stuff those away into partial views, razor views, to abstract them away into smaller components, partial views are great for that. If you're just reducing duplication of view content, again, kind of related to point number 1 there, I like to think of partial views as a great use case for very static content that gets reused all throughout the application. Maybe for some reason you don't want to include that in your master layout file because it doesn't get used on every page, but the majority of the pages. Partial views are great for that. And again, if you're porting an existing ASP.NET 4.x application to ASP.NET Core, your boss might say, sorry, we know that you want to do this, we just don't see the business value in it. There's not time or a budget to do that. And that's fine. Get to it when you can, but partial views are here to stay. Just another tool in the tool belt. So there are some supplementary resources I'd like to point out for everything we've talked about today. I actually wrote an extensive article on much of what we talked about today. It's available out on the Telerik Developer Network. There's a link here. And again, I'll share the slides out at the end. If you prefer audio, there's a podcast version of this that I did actually this summer. That's what you're seeing below there. It was on the Eat Sleep Code podcast, really focusing on use cases in that podcast. When is it most appropriate to use HTML helpers over tag helpers, things like that. I'd also like to put in a shameless plug for what I work on, docs.microsoft.com. So for those that have for a very long time relied on MSDN for your technical documentation, now is the time to start using docs.microsoft.com instead. And what the company is doing is we're slowly taking doc sets off of MSDN and porting them to this new platform. So MSDN will at some point disappear. On this slide, I've got a QR code which you can either scan to get the slide decks, or above that there's a bit.ly URL that will also take you to the slide decks. If there are any questions, feel free to ask after the session, come up and talk to me, find me on Twitter, ask me there. For those that know, okay, I'm going to use docs.microsoft.com, but primarily for ASP.NET Core information, the vanity URL to get you there quicker is docs.asp.net, and that would take you directly to the ASP.NET Core documentation instead of having to go to the main landing page and click your way through to find those. If you're looking for the sample code that I showed, those 2 sample applications, I've got 2 GitHub repositories that you can take a look out there. github.com/ScottAddie, and then below that you see the names of those 2 GitHub repos. Both of those are ASP.NET Core 2.0 applications targeting .NET Core 2.0. And I'd also like to point out that just because I'm targeting .NET Core doesn't mean it's not possible with .NET Framework. Everything I showed today in this talk is also possible if you're targeting .NET Framework. And the caveat there would be if you're targeting or if you're using ASP.NET Core 2.0, the minimum version of .NET Framework that you can target is 4.6.1. And then finally, there is a speaker evaluation form that they're asking us to have attendees fill out. That's the final bit.ly URL that you're seeing on the slide here. I would encourage you to go and fill that out. If the talk was terrible, by all means let them know. If you really enjoyed it, let them know that as well. With that, that is all I had for this talk. I'll certainly take questions, but thank you everyone for your time. I really appreciate it. So, questions? Anyone? Or feel free to come down. Question over here. Yeah, so the question was, is it possible to, my understanding is set view model properties from a tag helper? Yes, you could. You would just back that attribute in the markup with a public getter setter property. And by doing that, you could easily set that, that property. The example we were using was a player property, and that was actually defined as a getter setter, so that's how we were able to set its value. As far as how long that will live on, it's really just, that current session, obviously. So sort of like what you had in Angular, AngularJS. So does that answer your question? Okay. Any other questions? Don't be shy. No? Right here.
Right, so my question is, I saw that you're using decorators and also inheritance. So Microsoft has traditionally used inheritance and some decorators. Why do you guys go that way? Like, say, Angular uses decorators exclusively, but there's some...
Yeah, so the question for those that didn't hear it is, the examples showed both inheritance and decorating classes with attributes. The question was, why do we support both? Essentially, it comes down to preference. We have customers that are very vocal about, I hate attribution. I want to just inherit from a class. And we have customers that say the exact opposite thing. So in order to appease those customers and to continue to keep them happy and using our products, we support both. I suppose there may be some edge case where you have to do one or the other. Most of the time, it's just a matter of preference. So we try to cater to a broad audience by supporting both.
So what you're saying is that we can use only decorators and not inherit the tag helper?
You can mix both inheritance and decorators. We don't force you down one path or the other. So much like HTML helpers and tag helpers, you can mix those. Same is true with attribution and inheritance. You can mix those two approaches, and there's nothing wrong with that. Thing I would stress there is it's probably best to be consistent for the sake of resource portability, especially in the enterprise. As you move resources on and off of a project, you want those view components and tag helpers to be built in a consistent and predictable way. So, was there a question back here in the second row? It's so the question for people that didn't hear it is, you would have saw in one of my examples, I was using the name of operator, and there were two properties that I was pointing that at, the rank and the suit, and I was creating a comma delimited list. Question was, why not just allow an array there? It's for historical reasons. It's actually something that I brought up with the team 2 weeks ago because I looked at it as very clunky, and I hope I called it out as clunky. It's something that they're looking at cleaning up for a future release. I don't know what the solution will be, but I think you're on the right track when you say it would be better represented as an array, because that syntax was ugly. You're going to notice the same shortcoming in areas of the authentication and identity systems in ASP.NET Core. There's a similar problem there where you're defining multiple authentication schemes. Say it's cookies and something else like JWT. It's the same problem. You're creating a comma delimited list of strings instead of an array. Yes, scopes is another example. I expect that problem to be addressed in a future release. It's something they're looking at, but who knows how soon. So, but they've heard it loud and clear, and so I appreciate the feedback. I'll take that back to them. Any other questions? Right here. Mm-hmm. So the question here was around refactoring, and do things become more difficult to refactor, say if there's a property name change, comparing HTML helpers to tag helpers. What you're going to notice in tag helpers is they prefer to strongly type as many things as possible. And if you take the approach of using the name of operator, which is one of the reasons why I did it, you find yourself getting into less trouble. I find that if you don't do tricks like that along the way, yes, it can be more difficult to refactor tag helpers. And oftentimes you wouldn't find out about those problems until runtime, or hopefully before that, but in some cases runtime, because it's just a magic string. So if someone would have renamed my tag helper class, and I was just using a magic string to represent that, I would have been in a bit of trouble, especially if I wasn't real familiar with that code base. I would have figured it out eventually, but point is, it took me some time to do that troubleshooting. So yeah, it could be a little more difficult. There's a little more thought you have to put into the process when you're building these. Yep. Yep. Thank you. Any other question over here? Yeah, so the question was, we had the view imports CS/HTML file. Is there a plan to support a JSON representation of that? As far as I know, the answer is no, but it doesn't mean it's not going to happen. So we do have a user voice portal where you can log feature requests like this. In that particular example of the view imports file, another good place to go to start that discussion would be out on GitHub. So if you went to github.com/ASP.NET/MVC, that would be the perfect place to start that discussion with the engineering team. And I say there because they'd want to know a little bit more about your use case. You know, what is it about the CS/HTML view imports file that you don't like? Is there some edge case that they're not solving by forcing you to do it there? So, yeah. Any other questions? No? Okay. Again, I'll be up here. Feel free to come up. Thank you, everyone.